Some people are born with everything: money, privileges, opportunities. But for Adventure, this was her reality. Born into a wealthy family, she had always lived in a world where she was treated like royalty. Her mansion, her private school, her designer clothes, everything was top tier. Adventure had no concept of struggle, no idea what it meant to want for anything. She was spoilt, entitled, and used to getting whatever she wanted and when she wanted. But the more she had, the more she wanted, and that desire for more would eventually lead her down a dark and dangerous path. At school, Adventure was the queen bee. She wasn't just popular, she was feared. Her friends, a tight knit of similarly privileged and arrogant classmates, followed her lead without question. They tormented the less fortunate students for sport, laughing at their misfortune, throwing insults, and humbling them in the cruelest ways. Adventure loved the feeling and power it gave her. It made her feel untouchable, like she was above everyone else. She didn't just want to have everything, she wanted control over everyone and everything around her. The world was her playground, and the other kids, they were just obstacles to crush. One day, after a particularly nasty prank on a shy, quiet girl, Adventure felt a rush of exhilaration. The girl had stumbled, dropping her books in front of everyone. The laughter that followed rang in Adventure's ears, and for a moment she thought she might actually be invincible. But it wasn't enough. The next week, her group of friends suggested that they skip a class to attend an exclusive party. It was there, among the chaos and loud music, that Adventure first started to feel the itch for something bigger, something more dangerous. When she graduated from high school, Adventure moved on to university, expecting things to be the same. She quickly learned that no one at this new school was going to challenge her in the way she wanted. The campus was filled with the children of the wealthy, all with their own reputations and connections. But none of them had the power, the connections, and the influence that she craved. She wasn't content to sit at the top of the social ladder anymore. Now she wanted to climb even higher. She needed more, something that no one else had. But what exactly? She wasn't sure. Adventure spent her university years the same way she had spent her high school, partying, skipping classes, and gathering a new circle of friends who were just as wild and entitled as she was. They drank, partied, and lived without consequence, basking in the luxury of their family's wealth. But as the months passed, Adventure grew restless. The thrill of money, status, and fame had begun to fade, and something darker started to grow in her heart, a hunger for power that was insatiable. She didn't just want to be admired, she wanted to control everything. She wanted to bend the world to her will, to have the kind of influence that no one could question. But power, as she would soon learn, was never free. One night, while wandering the university campus after another drunken party, Adventure crossed paths with a man who would change everything. He was older, mysterious, and his eyes held a chilling intensity. He had been watching her, he said, and he could give her the power she sought. But the price was steep. Power, he whispered, always demands a price. Are you willing to pay it? At first, Adventure was skeptical. She had been offered deals and promises before, but none of them had ever tempted her. This was different. The way the man spoke, the way he saw her, it intrigued her. And she realized deep down that she was tired of the games. She wanted something real, something that would make her truly untouchable. The man told her of an underground group, a cycle of powerful individuals who had learned to control the very forces of life and death. They had wealth, influence, and connections that far surpassed anything Adventure had ever seen. But in exchange for these things, they required a sacrifice. To gain everything, you must be willing to give up something precious, he warned. Adventure, blinded by her ambition, didn't hesitate. The price, whatever it was, couldn't be worse than staying stuck in the same empty world she had always known. So she thought. She agreed, eager to step into the world of the powerful and the elite. That night, Adventure couldn't get the man's words out of her head. The promise of power had been too tempting. He had told her to meet him at an old abandoned building outside the city. And though every warning bell in her head told her it was a bad idea, Adventure couldn't resist. She had everything else. What was one more risk? She told herself it was just another test, another challenge to conquer. Power was waiting on the other side, and she wasn't about to back down. When she arrived, the building looked even worse than she had imagined. It was dark, the windows were broken, and the air felt cold, almost suffocating. But Adventure didn't hesitate. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, the hinges creaking in the silence. The man had promised her this would lead to everything she ever wanted. She couldn't back out now. The inside was just as eerie as the outside. Dim candlelight flickered in the corners of the room, casting strange shadows on the walls. Adventure's heart began to race, but she kept telling herself that this was normal, just part of the game. She wasn't scared. She had come this far. Then she saw him, the man from the party, standing in the middle of the room. He watched her approach with a strange cold smile. He wasn't alone. Around the room stood several other men, all in dark robes, their faces hidden in the shadows. Adventure froze for a moment, realizing she was completely out of her depth. "You're here," the man said in a voice that made Adventure's blood run cold. "You're ready." Before she could react, the men moved quickly, grabbing her before she even had time to scream. Panic surged through her as they pinned her down, their grip stronger than she expected. She tried to fight them off, but it was no use. They dragged her to the center of the room, tying her hands and feet so she couldn't escape. Adventure's breath came in quick gasps as she struggled, trying to pull away from them. "What is this? Let me go," she screamed. "This isn't what we agreed on." But the man just stood there, watching her with those cold eyes. "There is no turning back now," he said, his voice flat. "You wanted power, Adventure. This is what it cost." The word hit her like a slap. She had no idea what she had walked into. None of this was part of the plan. She tried to scream again, but her voice was muffled by the tight grip on her body. Her clothes were torn away by the men without a word. She fought with everything she had, but they were too strong. Soon, she was completely exposed, her skin chilled by the cold air and the hopelessness sinking into her heart. The man watched her as she lay there, helpless. He looked almost pleased with himself. "You're going to make your sacrifice now," he said, as if it was all part of a well-rehearsed script. Then, a new figure entered the room, a man with wild hair and vacant eyes. His movements were erratic, and his expression was twisted in a way that made Adventure's stomach turn. He looked like a madman, like someone who had lost their mind a long time ago. But there was something else in his eyes, something that told Adventure that he was more than just insane. He was part of the ritual. "This is the final step," the man said, his voice trembling with excitement. "To gain the power you want, you must give yourself to him." Adventure's heart pounded in her chest as the horrifying reality hit her all at once. The madman was going to sleep with her. She felt bile rise in her throat as her body trembled with disgust and fear. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw with terror. "Please, no! Help! Somebody, please! Help me!" But there was no one. The room was filled with silence, and no one came to her aid. Her cries for help echoed off the walls, but no one answered. The man from the party, the one who had promised her power, stood back, a cold smile on his lips. He watched her suffer, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. Adventure's breath caught in her throat as the madman stepped closer. Her body went numb with fear. This wasn't a game. She had made a terrible mistake, but it was too late now. She had already walked into this nightmare and there was no way out. The ritual had begun. The cold hair hit Adventure's skin as she lay there, trembling on the dirty ground. She felt numb, as though she had been drained of everything, her will, her strength, her dignity. The madman had forced himself on her, and now the room was empty, silent except for the faint flicker of the candles in the corners. She felt broken, shattered in a way that was beyond words. When it was over, the men didn't offer her any sympathy. They didn't say a word. Instead, they grabbed her roughly by the arms, dragging her out of the building. She could barely walk, her legs shaking beneath her, but they didn't care. The man who had promised her power led the way, his eyes cold and distant, as if it was all part of some cruel game. They didn't even look back as they left her in the dirt, dumping her by the side of the road like discarded trash. As the car sped away, Adventure sat there in the dust, her clothes torn, her body aching, her mind spinning. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. It felt like she was living someone else's nightmare. She could barely move, couldn't find the strength to stand. She was alone in the night, abandoned, with no one to help her and nowhere to turn. For hours, Adventure stayed there, too exhausted to cry, too confused to think. The only thing she could hear was the sound of cars driving by, their headlights briefly illuminating the darkness before they disappeared into the distance. She was invisible now, a forgotten girl in the world. No one cared about her, and no one was coming to save her. Weeks passed. Adventure couldn't go home. She couldn't. She couldn't face her parents, couldn't face anyone after what had happened. She wandered the streets, feeling lost and empty, like a ghost haunting the places she used to know. She wanted to forget everything, wanted to wake up and find that none of it had been real. 2 months later, Adventure wasn't feeling any better. The fear, trauma, were eating her up like a piece of cake. She felt so ashamed to speak to anyone, not even her fellow queen bees in the school. She felt out of place, lost, because the world she used to build up in her head was never real, and she felt so alone. Days later, Adventure started to feel nauseous and really strange. She kept eating anything that came her way and had weird cravings. Her so called friends brought it to her notice, but she shoved it off. The fever, nausea, and every other symptom she was having grew worse. So on a Saturday afternoon, she decided to go to the hospital. The doctor ran a series of tests on her, and the result came out. She was pregnant. At first, Adventure couldn't process it. She tried to deny it, thinking maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her, but the signs were too clear. Her world seems to tilt on its axis as the word sank in. Pregnant? She had never imagined this would be her life, that one night would leave her with a permanent mark she couldn't erase. The man, the madman had done this to her. The ritual, the pain, the loss of everything, and now this, a child, the result of a horrific, twisted event. Adventure's mind raced. She didn't know what to do, didn't know where to turn. She couldn't go back to her family. She couldn't face anyone. How would she explain this to them, to herself? Adventure spent the next few weeks in a constant state of panic, trying to figure out how to make the pregnancy go away. The weight of it was unbearable, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Every day, the reality of what had happened pressed harder on her chest. She couldn't handle the thought of carrying the child, especially knowing it had been conceived. She wanted to erase it, to make it all disappear, but no matter how hard she tried, the situation refused to be ignored. She went to multiple clinics, desperate for any solution. She begged the doctors to help her, her voice pleading and frantic. "I can't do this," she cried. "I can't keep it. Please help me." But every time she was turned away. The doctors looked at her with concern and then with pity, but none of them would touch her. "This pregnancy," they said, "it's not like any other." One doctor had told her coldly, "It's strange, we cannot risk it." They refused to perform any procedure, some even suggesting that it was beyond their expertise. Some murmured that they had never seen a pregnancy quite like this one. Something about it didn't sit right with them. It was as if they sensed that something more sinister was behind it, and they didn't want to be involved. Adventure was left with no options, just rejection after rejection. The weight of her situation pressed down on her. With nowhere left to turn, Adventure sank deeper into despair. She couldn't go home. She couldn't go back to school. Her friends, the ones who had once shared her world of parties and gossip, had all abandoned her. They didn't want to be around someone like her now, someone who had made such a mess of her life. The calls stopped, the text stopped, and she was left alone. She had no one, and worst of all, she didn't know how to fix it. She couldn't even look at herself anymore. Every time she passed the mirror, she saw a stranger staring back at her. The girl who once had everything, the confidence, the popularity, the world at her feet, was now a shell of herself. She didn't know where to go or who to turn to. One day, after yet another rejection at a clinic, Adventure wandered aimlessly through the streets. She had no plan, no direction. She was just lost. The sun was beginning to set, and the streets were filled with cars rushing home. Unaware of the girl walking amongst them, broken and invisible, she was so exhausted to think, her mind clouded with regret and desperation. As she crossed the street, lost in her thoughts, she was unaware of the vehicle coming and roaring towards her. One moment she was walking, and the next she was thrown to the ground. The impact knocking the breath out of her lungs. Everything was spinning, the world tilting sideways as pain shot through her body. The sound of the vehicle screeching to a halt was the last thing she heard before everything went blank. The hospital room was sterile and cold. Adventure laid motionless in the bed, her body bruised and battered from the accident. The doctors had worked hard to stabilize her, but her injuries were severe. She had been unconscious for days, her body fighting to heal. The hospital staff had called her parents, and when they arrived, their faces were filled with shock and disbelief. They had not seen their daughter in weeks. They had tried to reach her, but their calls and messages had gone unanswered. Now, here she was unconscious and broken in a hospital bed, a shadow of the girl they once knew. Her mother stood by her side, holding Adventure's hand tightly, as if she could will her daughter to wake up. "What happened to you, darling?" Her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What happened to my beautiful girl?" Her father stood at the foot of the bed, silent and pale, unable to speak. The sight of his daughter, broken and bruised, was too much for him to bear. The doctors had explained that Adventure was in a critical condition, but they didn't know if she could wake up. Her injuries were bad, and the time she had been unconscious was worrying. All they could do was wait. The accident had left Adventure in a coma for weeks. She laid in the sterile hospital room, her body still, but her mind locked away in the depths of her troubled subconscious. Her parents were devastated and confused, every day praying for her recovery. The doctors were baffled by her condition. They couldn't understand how someone so young could slip so far into such a deep mental state. The pregnancy that had mysteriously appeared, growing steadily with every passing day, added another layer of confusion. But what troubled them the most was the change they saw in their daughter when she finally awoke. When Adventure finally opened her eyes, it wasn't the world she expected. The blinding hospital lights above, the rhythmic beep of the machines, the sterile scent of antiseptic. Nothing felt familiar. Everything was blurred. Her thoughts scattered like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite put together. She tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Her throat felt dry and she struggled to focus her vision. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach. The pregnancy was still there, very much real. It was growing. The bump was now very much visible. The doctors had been unable to explain it. The last thing Adventure remembered was waking up in the streets after the car accident, and then everything went dark again. Her parents were sitting by her side when she finally spoke, but when she did, her words didn't make sense. She asked about people who weren't there, spoke of events that had never happened. Her sentences were jumbled, her gaze vacant and focused. It was clear that something was wrong. Her parents, once hopeful that she could recover, were now faced with the reality that their daughter was lost in a way they couldn't reach. Few days later, an adventure's condition didn't improve. If anything, it worsened. She became more withdrawn, speaking in fragmented sentences, her thoughts disconnected from the world around her. She would often stare blankly at the walls, tears streaming down her face for reasons she couldn't explain. The doctors finally came to a heartbreaking conclusion. She is mentally unstable, they said. The trauma from the accident, combined with the strange circumstances surrounding her pregnancy, seems to have pushed her into a state of severe psychological distress. We believe it will be best if she will be transferred to a psychiatric facility for further treatment. The words hit her parents like a blow to their chest. They couldn't believe it, their precious daughter, the girl they had loved and spoiled, who had attended the finest schools and had the world at her feet, was now a shell of herself, lost in a world of confusion and pain. They had always given her everything, tried to protect her from the harsh realities of life, hoping that their wealth and care would keep her safe. But now, as they watched their daughter, once so vibrant and full of life, slipping away from them, they couldn't help but wonder, where had they gone wrong? The decision to move Adventure to a psychiatric facility was one of the hardest choices her parents ever had to make. It broke their hearts to see their daughter in such a fragile state. The hospital staff carefully prepared them for the worst, that she might not ever fully recover, but they still clung to a small thread of hope, praying that somehow their daughter would wake up from this nightmare. Weeks turned into months, and Adventure was transferred to the psychiatric home. Her parents visited her every week, but each time they were greeted by a girl they didn't recognize. She had become a stranger to them, someone they couldn't help, no matter how hard they tried. And as they left the facility after one of their visits, a deep sorrow settled over them. They realized that no amount of money or privilege could shield their daughter from the consequences of her choices. The path she had chosen, the wayward, reckless path, had led her to this place. They could only hope that in time she would find the strength to overcome her inner demons. But for now, they could only watch from a distance, hoping that she would become better someday. Adventure's story may be one of loss, confusion, and heartbreak, but it is also a powerful reminder of the consequences of our choices. The road she traveled was filled with selfishness and greed, but her wake up call is one that we can all learn from. No matter where you've been or what you've done, it's never too late to change. If Adventure's story made you reflect on your own life, share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever made mistakes that taught you valuable lessons? How do you see the importance of change and growth? If you want more stories that make you think, stories that challenge your perspective and inspire change, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Thank you for watching and see you on the next one.